Our Bible word is Matthew 21, verses 14 to 15. Then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple and saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. So this is Jesus. Jesus entered Jerusalem, his triumphal entry. And after his triumphal entry, he goes to the Jerusalem. And that's our textual unit is from Matthew 21, verses 12 to 17. And that is the activity of Jesus in the temple. That's his cleansing and his healing. So Jesus, he enters Jerusalem on a donkey. And people hail him. They say, Hosanna, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord, etc. And they call him Son of David, etc. Those are titles for the Messiah. And then Jesus goes into the temple. And of course we are familiar with what's traditionally called the cleansing of the temple, which is not really an accurate description, but anyway, let's read from verses 12. It says, Then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, It is written, My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. So what's going on here? It's Jesus specifically says here to some people there, but you have made it a den of thieves. So who's this you that Jesus is addressing? He's addressing the chief priests and their associates. In other words, people that worked closely with him, their scribes. In other words, people that wrote things down or were the educated and the literate people of the law, etc. And these chief priests, we must understand that at this time, there was, of course, Caiaphas. He was the acting high priest at this time. But he was not the real power as high priest. The real power was his father-in-law, Annas. And Annas, and the house of Annas, they were this family. And of course, at the helm was Annas. They were the most powerful family in Jerusalem in the first half of the first century. They controlled the temple. They were the leaders of Jewish society. Of course, appointed by the Romans, or before that, the time of Herod the Great, etc., or his sons, or whatever. The priests were always appointed. So Annas himself, he was appointed as high priest in the year 6. And he was high priest from 6 to 15 AD. And if you look at the list on screen there now, you can see all those in blue. They are all the sons. Or in the case of Caiaphas, Caiaphas was a son-in-law of Annas, who were high priests. So there was Annas himself, then his son 𝐻𝐿𝐴zar was high priest from 16 to 17. There were also other high priestly families, as we could see. That's Ishmael ben Feabi and Shimon ben Carmith. And after that there was Joseph Caiaphas. That was the son-in-law of Annas. Then there's a son of Annas, Jonathan. Another son, Theophilus. Another son, Matthias. And later on, Annas. Like this is a son of Annas, who was high priest in 62. And this Annas, he was the one that executed James. That's Jesus' brother. And we don't read of that in the New Testament, but Josephus writes about it in his writings, that at this time they stoned James to death. Because at this time James, he was actually the head of the church in Jerusalem. And later on, we also see the grandson of Annas was high priest in 65 to 67 AD. So if you look there on screen, you can see that the family of Annas, how they dominated the high priesthood. So over a period of 60 years, 8 of the high priests were from the house of Annas. And also from the appointment of Annas in 6 AD until the trial of Jesus, that's about in 30 or 33 AD, the family of Annas controlled the high priesthood for 25 of 27 years. So we can see that the house of Annas. We read of Annas in the New Testament. We read of him in the Gospel of John and also in the writings of Luke. Because when Jesus was set on trial, he sent both to Annas and to Caiaphas. But remember, Annas, he was the real power behind the high priesthood. If you can liken them to a temple mafia, Annas, he was like the Don. He was the big boss. He was the man in charge. And Caiaphas, basically, he was high priest at the will and discretion, or also at the pleasure of Annas. So Annas was the real power here. And this house of Annas, this family, of course, they controlled the temple. They were also the representatives of the people, because they were appointed by the Romans. They were appointed to keep the peace. They must make sure that all the tax revenue comes in, that the Romans can take, etc. So for them, they had to keep the peace. Apart from being the ruler of the people, also the spiritual rulers of the people in a sense, because the high priest, he made sacrifices, also especially on the Day of Atonement, special sacrifices were made by him. But now the dark side of this house of Annas, of course, they were extremely wealthy. They made lots of money from the temple because they supplied the inspected animals like doves or even sheep, etc., that can be sacrificed at the Passover. So they obviously did that for a fee. They also made money when people brought their coins to exchange it for this special coinage. It's called the Tyrian shekel. And the Tyrian shekel was preferred because it had a very high silver content. And it was only this Tyrian shekel that the high priestly establishment accepted as the annual temple tax that had to be paid by the people. So when they came to Jerusalem, for Passover on pilgrimage, of course they would spend money to buy the sacrificial animals for the Passover and other sacrifices. That's how the house of Annas made money. And the house of Annas also made money when they exchanged their coins for the Tyrian shekels, because they would charge a fee also built on that. So they were very rich, the house of Annas. And today archaeologists, they've uncovered a home there in the northern part of, or not the upper Jerusalem. That's where the wealthy lived, the rich. And they uncovered a house here that's also, it says a very wealthy person lived here. They actually refer to this house as the palatial mansion. It was decorated with all kinds of motifs, etc. And they actually identify this house to belong to the house of Annas. And there's also been this house where, in the courtyard there, where Jesus would have been brought, and of course where Peter came and also he did not recognize or betray Jesus. It would have been this house of Annas. It was a big house, and many of his sons also lived there together with him. So remember, imagine this. There's a house of Annas. They're in charge of Jewish society. They are the wealthiest family. They are the most powerful family in Jerusalem. They dominate. They control the temple. And here comes Jesus. He enters the temple. And let's go read verses 12 again. Then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer. But you," now Jesus is addressing here the high priests, the various high priests, and of course also their associates, "you have made it a den of thieves." Jesus saying you're exploiting the temple, and you're exploiting the God's people for your own wealth. And of course the place where this would have happened is there in the court of Gentiles, as you can see on screen now. That's that big open area to the south of the temple itself. Temporary tables were set up here where people could buy animals, also where coins could be exchanged. So that was especially done over the time of Passover. So all of this was done, managed by the house of Annas, and this is where the house of Annas also made lots of money by offering the service to the pilgrims that come to Jerusalem. And here enters Jesus, and he confronts them. He says, "You have made it a den of thieves." Of course, a den is a place where thieves go. That's their place of protection. That's their place of safety. That's their hideout. So Jesus says, this is your hideout, you thieves. This is your den. This is where you think you are safe. This is where you think that nothing will happen to you. And yet Jesus challenges them. Of course, through his action, by overturning the tables, etc., he also symbolically destroys the temple. He acts as a prophet. He has prophetic symbolism behind this act. It's not because Jesus was against the temple itself or against animal sacrifice as such. He was against the exploitation of the temple by the house of Annas. And also later on, if you go to chapter 26 verses 2 and also 27 verses 40, there's these accusations of him where they say, you said you'll destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. So I'm sure also when Jesus overturned these tables, he also said, this temple I will destroy and I will raise it in 3 days. So it was an symbolic act of destruction that Jesus also says here. Now, of course, the house of Annas, they're there. They see Jesus. And for them, Jesus would have been just basically an irritation. This guy that comes from Galilee, he comes to Jerusalem, he's popular with some people, and now he comes into the temple, and now he confronts them. He confronts their authority. Because if he is what he is, the Son of David, the Messiah, gone is their life of privilege. Gone is their life of wealth and of ruling over God's people, so to speak. And also, if the Messiah is here, from their perspective, peace would go away. And if peace goes, we go because we didn't do our jobs properly. And there might be war with Rome. And so that, from their perspective, a lot to lose. And now let's come to our Bible word. If we go read verse 14. Then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did. Now, who are these chief priests? Let's go back to that list. It was probably Annas. It was also Eleazar, the son of Annas. Probably Joseph, Caiaphas also. Maybe also of the other high priestly families, Ishmael and Shimon. They were there. They looked at Jesus, also doing these healings. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple and saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. So in other words, Hosanna to the Messiah, because that was a title for the Messiah. They were indignant and said to him, do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said, of course, yes. Have you never read, out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants, you have perfected praise. And there he's quoting from Psalm 8 verses 2. So Jesus is here, and he confronts the authority of the house of Annas and also the prophet, their whole life, their leadership, their life of privilege, etc. And he's hailed as the Messiah, the Son of David. If this is true, this house of Annas, these high priests have everything to lose. And especially if people believe it, etc. Now, of course, for them, Jesus would have just been a nuisance. He's here and now he must be taken care of because he's here. He's a threat. And of course, it was primarily this house of Annas, Caiaphas and his father-in-law who orchestrated the arrest of Jesus and also his trial before Pilate. It was these groups, this high priestly family and their associates that worked close with him, that were there shouting for Jesus, crucify him, crucify him. Because Jesus posed a threat to their authority and their position of power and privilege.